They told you it was a miracle. They told you that one day, under the bright sun of the Mediterranean, logic just appeared out of nowhere. They told you that white men in togas, Pythagoras, Plato, Aristotle, woke up and invented philosophy, mathematics, and science from thin air. They call it the Greek miracle. It is the foundation of every Western history book. It is the lie that built the modern world. But let's paint it plain. There are no miracles in history. There are only precedents. And when you look at the timeline, when you really scrub the dirt off the dates, the Greek miracle starts to look like a crime scene. It wasn't a birth. It was a heist. They told you civilization began in Athens. It didn't. It began thousands of miles south, up the river, in the mind of a black priest in the Nile Valley. They told you Pythagoras discovered the theorem. He didn't. He spent 22 years copying it from African walls, where it had sat for 1,000 years before he was born. Let's look at the suspect. Pythagoras. The man they teach your children is the father of mathematics. The history books paint him as a solitary genius, a man who pulled numbers from the ether. But the receipts tell a different story. The receipts show a man who fled the intellectual poverty of Samos to beg for entry at the gates of Waset. They show a man who shaved his head, wore the white linen, and sat at the feet of Egyptian priests for decades. You don't spend 20 years in a foreign land just to enjoy the weather. You stay because you are learning something you cannot find at home. You stay because you are a student. But when he returned to Greece, the footnotes disappeared. The citations vanished. The student of Egypt became the father of math, and the world clapped. This is the mechanism of the lie. You take the finished product, you burn the receipt, and you claim the patent. Why does this matter? Because they didn't just steal a theorem. They stole the intellectual credit for the human race. By framing the Greeks as the originators of thought, they pushed Africa into the shadows. They made you believe that black history is only physical, labor, strength, endurance. They erased the cerebral. They erased the architect, the astronomer, the surgeon. They told you that while Europe was thinking, Africa was sleeping. That is the betrayal. It wasn't just a lie about who drew a triangle. It was a strategic, centuries-long campaign to disconnect the African mind from its own creation. They needed you to believe that reason was white, so that later they could justify owning the bodies of the people who actually invented it. You cannot enslave a people if you admit they taught you how to think. So they had to kill the teacher to claim the lesson. This isn't ancient history. This is an active crime scene. Walk into any university today. Look at the statues. Look at the names on the buildings. It is a monument to the theft. They celebrate the thief and ignore the bank he robbed. But evidence never sleeps. The stones in Egypt are still talking. The papyrus scrolls, the ones they didn't manage to burn, are still whispering the truth. We are going to walk through the timeline. We are going to look at the journals of the Greeks themselves. Men like Herodotus who, unlike modern historians, actually admitted where they got their knowledge. Herodotus called the Egyptians the wisest of men. He didn't hide it. But the historians who came after him, the ones who needed to build a narrative of European supremacy, they took out the eraser. They took out the white paint. Here's the part they don't teach. The Greek philosophers were not persecuted in Greece because they were too smart. They were persecuted because they were teaching foreign doctrines. They were teaching Egyptian spirituality and Egyptian science, and the Athenian state hated them for it. Socrates was killed for it. Pythagoras was run out of town for it. They were viewed as importers of a strange African wisdom. Yet today, we call them the pillars of the West. It is the ultimate irony. The West worships men who were originally hated for trying to be African. We are going to strip away the marble and the myth. We are going to look at the dates, the maps, and the money. The lie is comfortable. The truth is, a bill that is past due. And today, we are here to collect. You need to understand what the world looked like before the miracle. You need to scrub the image of the desert ruin from your mind. Stop seeing the pyramids as dusty tombstones. Close your eyes and see them as they were. Blinding white limestone, capped in electrum gold, burning like artificial suns against the blue sky. This wasn't a civilization trying to survive. This was a civilization that had mastered the earth. While the Greeks were still living in huts and fighting over goat herds, Kemet, the Black Land, was charting the stars with a precision that NASA still respects. They had paved roads. They had a healthcare system. They had centralized government. They had a moral code, Maat, that predates the Bible by millennia. This was dominance. This was a society so wealthy in knowledge that it didn't hoard it. It spilled over. Let's zoom in on Waset. The Greeks called it Thebes. The Bible called it Noamun. But to the people who built it, it was the city of the scepter. In the center of this city stood Ipet-Isut, the temple of Karnak. They call it a temple. That's a soft word. It was a university. It was a fortress of data. It was the most select of places. Imagine a complex covering 200 acres. Libraries stacked with scrolls on anatomy, engineering, astronomy, and law. This wasn't magic. It was science. They had the House of Life, the Per Ankh, where scribes didn't just copy text. They debated the nature of the universe. They calculated the circumference of the earth. They understood the movement of the blood in the body. This was the Oxford, the Harvard, the MIT of the ancient world, operating at full capacity, while London was a swamp and Athens was a village. Picture the students. They weren't wearing togas. They were shaven-headed priests with dark skin, wearing leopard skins and white linen. They were the guardians of the mysteries. They held the measuring cords. They knew the secrets of the geometry that could align a building with the North Star. They controlled the Nile's floodwaters with mathematics. Wealth doesn't disappear. It transfers. But before the transfer, you have to see the sheer magnitude of the asset. The intellectual capital of Kemet was staggering. It was a magnet. It pulled people from across the known world. If you wanted to know anything about the reality of existence, you had to book a ticket to Egypt. You had to cross the Mediterranean and beg for a seat in the lecture hall of the sun. Enter the Greeks. They didn't arrive as conquerors. Not yet. They arrived as refugees of ignorance. Thales, the so-called first philosopher of Greece, he told Pythagoras to go to Egypt. He said, "If you want to be wise, go south." Solon, the great lawgiver of Athens, he went to Egypt. And what did the Egyptian priest Sanchez say to him? He looked at the Greek statesman and laughed. He said, "Oh, Solon, Solon, you Greeks are always children. There is no such thing as an old Greek." Think about the weight of that insult. He was telling him, you have no history. You have no deep memory. Everything you know is new and fragile. The Greeks admitted this. They wrote it down. They stood in awe of the black priests. They were tourists in a land of giants, scribbling notes, trying to catch the crumbs falling from the table of Kemet. This wasn't a partnership. It was an apprenticeship. The before picture is clear. You have a massive, thriving, scientifically advanced African civilization acting as the lighthouse for the world. You have a young, scrappy, uneducated European culture coming to learn. There is no shame in being a student. The shame is in graduating, killing the professor, and telling the world you taught yourself. We are going to look at the specific threat this power posed, because intellectual dominance is the most dangerous kind of power. If you know more than the man with the sword, eventually, you will rule him. Or, he will have to destroy you to keep his pride. The Greeks sat in those temples for centuries, writing, watching, learning. And when they had enough, the narrative began to shift. The student began to eye the master's chair. Why did they have to hide it? Why couldn't they just say, "Thank you, Egypt, for the geometry"? Why the need for the total erasure? You have to understand the nature of the threat. It wasn't about land. It wasn't about gold. It was about legitimacy. You cannot build a philosophical justification for white supremacy if the foundation of your intellect is black. It's a structural impossibility. If you admit that the African mind unlocked the secrets of the universe, the stars, the cells, the stones, then you cannot later claim that the African mind is primitive. And if you cannot claim it is primitive, you cannot justify the chains. The success of Kemet was a glitch in the software of the rising European ego. It was a contradiction that had to be resolved. Let's paint it plain. Knowledge is the ultimate capital. It is more valuable than oil. It is more stable than gold. If you know when the river floods, you control the food supply. If you know how to navigate by the stars, you control international trade. If you know the ratios of architecture, you control the infrastructure. Kemet didn't just have culture, they had the patent on civilization. This dominance was dangerous. It meant that Greece, and later Rome, were structurally dependent on Africa for their high-level functioning. Imagine the insecurity. Imagine the envy. You are a Greek general, draped in iron, commanding armies. But when you get sick, you have to pray to a black god, or read a scroll written by a black physician to get cured. That dynamic creates a deep, festering resentment. It creates a need to not just conquer the body, but to colonize the mind. The threat was also theological. This is the part they don't teach. The Egyptian mystery system wasn't just religion. It was a comprehensive theory of existence that linked man to the divine through discipline and study. It taught that humans could become godlike. The Greeks were terrified and mesmerized by this. Their gods were petty, jealous, and chaotic, rapists and thieves living on a mountain. The Egyptian Neteru were principles of order, truth, and justice. Maat. The threat was the sophistication of the African soul. If the world accepted the Egyptian worldview, the Greek worldview looks childish in comparison. So, the establishment of the West had a problem. They wanted the power of the knowledge, but they hated the source of the knowledge. They wanted the fruit, but they despised the tree. Consider the economics of influence. As long as Waset, Thebes, was the center of the intellectual world, the gold of the mind flowed south. Scholars, tuition, tribute, respect, it all went up the Nile. To shift the center of the world to Athens or Alexandria, they had to break the monopoly. They couldn't compete with Kemet on the merits. You don't outcompete a civilization that has a 3,000-year head start. You have to execute a hostile takeover. You have to declare the old management incompetent, seize the assets, and put your name on the door. The threat wasn't that Egypt would attack Greece. The threat was that Egypt rendered Greece irrelevant. And for a rising empire, irrelevance is worse than death. This wasn't a sudden decision. It was a slow creep of realization. As the Greeks sat in those temples, scribbling notes, they realized the gap between their culture and Kemet was a canyon. They knew that as long as the originals existed, they would always be the children Solon was mocked as. To become the fathers of civilization, they had to orphan the world. They had to cut the cord. The threat of black excellence is that it disproves the lie of white superiority without saying a word. It just exists. And its existence was intolerable. So, the plan wasn't just to learn. The plan became to replace. They needed the knowledge to be portable, and they needed it to be pale. They needed to strip the melanin from the math. How do you steal a civilization? You don't use guns at first. You use paper. You don't start with a massacre. You start with a translation. The mechanism of the theft was surgical, bureaucratic, and relentless. It began in earnest with Alexander. They call him the Great. Let's look at the receipts. When Alexander marched into Egypt in 332 BC, he didn't burn it down immediately. He was smarter than that. He wanted to be a pharaoh. He went to the oracle of Siwa to be confirmed as the son of Amun. He bowed to the black gods. But his generals, the Ptolemies who took over after he died, they had a different strategy. They initiated the greatest intellectual money laundering operation in human history. Enter the Library of Alexandria. They sell this to you as a beacon of light, a gathering of the world's wisdom. It wasn't. It was a crime scene. It was a chop shop. The Ptolemies stripped the temples of the south, Waset, Memphis, Heliopolis, of their sacred scrolls. They carted thousands of years of research down the river to Alexandria, and there the mechanism went to work. Army after army of Greek scribes sat in those halls, taking the Egyptian texts and translating them into Greek. But it wasn't a faithful translation. It was a rebranding. Here's the trick. When they translated the concept of Jehuti, the Egyptian principle of divine wisdom, they didn't keep the name. They changed it to Thoth, and then to Hermes Trismegistus. Suddenly, the author is Greek. When they translated the medical texts of Imhotep, the multi-genius who designed the step pyramid, they changed his name to Asclepius. Suddenly, the father of medicine is a Greek god. This is the mechanism. Appropriate. Rename. Erase. It's identity theft on a civilizational scale. They took the theorem of the rectangle, what you call A, B2, C2, and eventually slapped Pythagoras' name on it, despite the fact that Egyptian rope stretchers had been using it to build pyramids while Pythagoras' ancestors were living in caves. The visual pacing of this era is frantic. Picture the harbor of Alexandria, ships arriving not with goods, but with books of the ships, a law that said any ship docking had to surrender its books to be copied. The library kept the originals and gave the copies back. Or, sometimes, they just kept both. They were hoarding the intellectual property of the ancient world, but the insidious part was the systematic exclusion of the native Egyptians. The priests, the original authors, were pushed to the margins. Their language, the Medu Neter, was slowly discouraged in favor of Greek. If you wanted to be an intellectual in the New World, you had to speak the language of the colonizer. You had to cite the Greek translation, not the Egyptian original. This created a filter, a wall. On one side, you had the ancient, sacred African wisdom. On the other side, you had the new Greek philosophy. The mechanism ensured that the world only saw the Greek version. It's like taking a masterpiece painting, scraping off the signature, signing your own name, and burning the artist's studio. By the time the Romans arrived, the mechanism had done its work. The Egyptian origin was treated as a myth, a rumor, a mystery. The Greek origin was treated as fact. The mechanism wasn't violent in the bloody sense, not yet. It was violent in the administrative sense. It was the violence of the pen. It was the violence of the archive. They used the bureaucracy of the library to launder the origin of human thought. And let's look at the economics of this mechanism. By controlling the texts, they controlled the universities. By controlling the universities, they controlled the narrative of the future. They engineered a reality where Africa was seen as a place of raw materials, gold, grain, bodies, but never a place of raw intellect. They stripped the continent of its greatest asset, its reputation as the teacher of the world. This wasn't an accident. You don't accidentally rename every god and every science. You do it by design. You do it to create a new hierarchy. The mechanism was efficient, cold, and successful. It turned the teachers into witch doctors and the students into philosophers. And we are still paying the tuition for that lie today. Let's walk through the crime scene. And make no mistake, it is a crime scene. We are not looking for fingerprints. We are looking for ash. The greatest heist in history required. The greatest cover-up in history, and fire, is the ultimate cleaner. They told you the burning of the Library of Alexandria was a tragedy for Western civilization. That is the lie. The burning of the library was the greatest stroke of luck Western supremacy ever had. Why? Because when the flames licked the ceiling, when the cedar shelves turned to charcoal, what actually burned? The originals, the Egyptian papyri, the source code, the receipts. And what survived? The copies. The Greek translations that had been exported to Rome, to Byzantium, to the Arab world. The fire destroyed the evidence of the tuition, leaving only the work of the student. It's convenient, isn't it? If you burn the bank, nobody knows who deposited the money. You only know who is holding the cash when the smoke clears. Visualize the catastrophe. It wasn't just one fire. It was a series of arsons spanning centuries, from Caesar to the Zealots. But the result was always the same. The African voice was silenced. Imagine the smell of burning history, the acrid smoke of millions of scrolls turning to dust. Within those scrolls were the detailed records of the priests of Waset teaching the men of Athens. Within those scrolls were the timelines proving that the Pythagorean theorem was used to survey the Nile floodplain 1,000 years before Pythagoras was a glint in his father's eye. The fire didn't just destroy data, it destroyed context. It left us with a history that starts in the middle. It left us with a Greek miracle that floats in a vacuum, untethered to the massive African foundation that supported it. This was the destruction of the bibliography. But the crime scene isn't just in the ashes of the library. It is carved into the stone itself. Look at the statues. Look at the Sphinx. They told you the nose fell off due to erosion. They told you it was wind and sand. Let's paint it plain. Wind does not target the center of a face. Wind does not chisel off the broad nose and the thick lips while leaving the ears perfectly intact. This was facial reconstruction with a hammer. Whether it was Mamluks, French soldiers, or early iconoclasts, the intent is identical. De-Africanization. You smash the nose because the nose proves the lineage. You destroy the lips because the lips tell the truth. If the Sphinx looks like a black man, then the narrative of white supremacy crumbles before it even begins. So you have to deface the monument to save the lie. Walk deeper into the temples. Look at the reliefs on the walls of Luxor. You will see gouge marks. You will see cartouches, the nameplates of the kings, hacked out of the granite. This is not random vandalism. This is targeted assassination of memory. When a new power took over, whether it was the Ptolemies, the Romans, or later colonial powers, they couldn't handle the visual evidence of black greatness staring down at them. It made them feel small. It made them feel like imposters. So they engaged in an industrial-scale effort to modify the stone. They plastered over the murals. They repainted the skin tones. They chipped away the afro-textured hair. They turned the crime scene into a renovation project, gentrifying history until the original owners were unrecognizable. And here is the part they don't teach. The looting wasn't just destruction. It was extraction. The obelisks of Egypt, those massive granite needles pointing to the sun, were taken, stolen, dragged across the sea to stand in squares in Rome, in Paris, in London, in New York. They stand there today, trophies of the heist. But notice what they did. They took the object, but they left the meaning. A tourist in London looks at Cleopatra's Needle and sees a cool stone. They don't see the Tekken, the symbol of resurrection, the scientific instrument used to track the sun. They stripped the artifact of its soul and turned it into a lawn ornament. The crime scene is global. The evidence of the theft is standing in the center of the Vatican, staring you in the face, while the people who built it are erased from the story of its creation. You don't just kill the man, you kill the memory. Erasure is more efficient than war. War is messy. Erasure is clean. War costs money. Erasure pays dividends forever. Once the physical evidence was damaged, the library burned, the noses smashed, the second phase of the operation began. The intellectual bleaching. The goal was simple: separate Egypt from Africa. They had to perform a geographical lobotomy. They had to take the greatest civilization in human history, which sat squarely on the African continent, fed by the African interior, populated by African people, and mentally drag it into the Mediterranean or the Middle East. They had to make Egypt white adjacent. They had to create a category that was too civilized to be black. The primary weapon of erasure was language. For 3,000 years, the Medu Nader, the hieroglyphs, was the voice of the gods. It was a script that combined sound, concept, and magic. But as the Greeks and Romans took over administrative control, the script was suffocated. It was outlawed in government. It was mocked as pagan superstition. The last priest who could read the walls died, and with him, the silence fell. This was the Dark Age, not for Europe, but for truth. For 1,500 years, nobody could read the walls. The stones were screaming, but the world was deaf. This silence allowed the liars to fill in the blanks. They could look at a mural of a dark-skinned man and say, "That's a slave," even if the text next to him identified him as a king. Without the language, the history was defenseless. Then came the academics, the men with the tenure and the tweed jackets, the 18th and 19th century Egyptologists who formalized the erasure. They created the Hamitic hypothesis. This was the pseudo-scientific theory that said, okay, we admit Egypt was great, but the people who built it couldn't have been real Africans. They must have been a lost branch of the white race who turned dark in the sun. Let's run that back. They invented a fake race to explain away black genius. They measured skulls. They manipulated data. They threw away evidence that didn't fit the theory. They walked past millions of living, breathing black Egyptians and Nubians to dig up dead ones, claiming the dead ones were white while the living ones were invisible. It was mental gymnastics on an Olympic level. The erasure entered the classroom. It entered the Bible. Look at how they paint the biblical figures who lived in and out of Egypt. Moses, Joseph, Jesus. They paint them with blue eyes and straight hair. They took a story set in Northeast Africa, at the crossroads of civilizations that were undeniably melanated, and turned it into a Scandinavian family reunion. This visual programming is the most insidious form of erasure because it hits you before you can read. A child sees a white Jesus and a white Pharaoh before they ever open a history book. The neural pathway is already paved. Power is white. Holiness is white. Civilization is white. To undo that programming takes more than a fact. It takes a revolution of the mind. And finally, the erasure of the connection. They cut the Nile. In reality, the Nile flows south to north. The culture, the DNA, the gods, the gold, it all flowed from the deep interior of Africa, Nubia, Kush, Punt, down into Egypt. Egypt was the flower. The roots were deep in black Africa. But the erasure reversed the river. They told you Egypt was influenced by Mesopotamia, by Greece, by aliens, anyone but Africa. They drew a line in the sand south of Aswan and said, below this is Africa. Above this is Egypt. That line is a lie. It is a colonial border drawn on a map of history. They erased the umbilical cord. They orphaned the child to steal the inheritance. And now, we have a world where people ask, was Cleopatra black? As if it's a debate, instead of asking, why is the continent that birthed humanity the only one stripped of its accolades? They say, imitation is the highest form of flattery. That is a lie. Imitation without citation is plagiarism. And when you build an entire civilization on the blueprints of another while claiming you drew them yourself, it's not flattery. It's fraud. We need to look at the blueprint of the West. They tell you the Greeks invented democracy, architecture, medicine, and the very concept of the soul. But when you lay the Greek blueprint over the Egyptian reality, the lines match up too perfectly. It's a trace job. It's a cut-and-paste operation performed by a culture that was desperate for legitimacy. They didn't just take the math. They took the style, the gods, and the symbols of power. They walked into the house of Kemet, took the furniture, and rearranged it in Athens, claiming they carved the wood themselves. Let's start with the architecture. Look at the Parthenon. Look at the Doric, columns that hold up the symbols of Western democracy in Washington, D.C. They tell you this is classical Greek style. Let's paint it plain. Those fluted columns? They are stone copies of bundles of papyrus reeds. The Egyptians were building stone columns that mimicked nature 2,000 years before the Greeks stacked their first marble block. Walk through the colonnade of the step pyramid of Djoser. It was built by Imhotep in 2600 BC. Then look at the Greek temples built in 400 BC. The DNA is undeniable. The Greeks didn't invent the column. They imported it. They took the hypostyle hall of Karnak and shrunk it down. But in the history books, the copy is hailed as a masterpiece of proportion, while the original, the massive, awe-inspiring original, is dismissed as monumentalism. That is the trick. You devalue the source to inflate the value of the copy. Now, let's look at the gods. The theft of the divine is the most audacious part of the blueprint. The Greek pantheon, Zeus, Apollo, Dionysus, is a soap opera remix of the Egyptian Neteru. They didn't even try to hide it back then. Herodotus admitted that almost all the names of the gods came to Greece from Egypt. Zeus is Amun-Ra, with a dye job and a lightning bolt. Dionysus, the god of resurrection and wine, is a direct lift of Osiris. The stories, the archetypes, the functions, they are African concepts dressed in European drag. But the Greeks changed something crucial. The Egyptian gods were cosmic principles: nature, truth, justice. The Greek gods were messy humans with superpowers: rapists, thieves, and liars. They took the profound spirituality of the blueprint and lowered the frequency. They took the word of God and turned it into a telenovela. Let's talk about the soul. Plato is famous for his theories on the immortality of the soul, the judgment after death, and the transmigration of the spirit. They teach this in Philosophy 101 as the brilliance of the Greek mind. But, wait. The Egyptians had mapped the geography of the afterlife in the Pert M. Heru, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, when Plato's ancestors were still painting caves. The concept of the psychostasia, the weighing of the soul against the feather of truth, is purely Egyptian. Plato didn't invent the immortal soul. He studied the Egyptian concept of the Ba and the Ka. He sat in the temples where the judgment of Osiris was painted on every wall. To claim Plato discovered the soul is like claiming a tourist discovered the ocean because he dipped his toe in it. The blueprint for human spirituality was drawn in the Nile Valley. The West just built a smaller house on the same foundation. And finally, medicine. The Hippocratic Oath. Doctors today still swear by it. They swear by Apollo the physician. But who is the real father? Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, admits he studied the medical library of the Temple of Imhotep. The symbol of medicine today, the caduceus, the staff with the two snakes, is not Greek. It is the staff of Thoth. It represents the Kundalini energy rising. It represents the dual nature of the universe. The Greeks took the symbol, but they forgot the science behind it. They took the what and left the why. The stolen blueprint is everywhere. It's in the stars they renamed. It's in the constellations they claimed. It's in the very word chemistry, which comes from Kemet, the Black Land. The West is wearing a suit tailored in Africa, strutting down the runway of history, pretending they stitched the fabric themselves. We have talked about the culture, the gods, and the stones. Now, let's run the numbers. Let's talk about the economics of the theft. Because this wasn't just a cultural exchange, it was a transfer of intellectual capital that is worth trillions in today's currency. Wealth doesn't disappear. It transfers. and knowledge is the ultimate form of wealth. Think of the Greek miracle not as a miracle, but as a tuition-free scholarship program funded by Africa. Pythagoras spent 22 years in Egypt. Plato spent 13 years. Eudoxus spent 16 years. Calculate the cost. Who paid for their room and board? Who paid for access to the greatest libraries in the world? Who paid the professors, the priests, who taught them? Egypt subsidized the education of Europe. They gave away the most valuable asset on the planet, advanced data, for free. And what did Europe do? They took that free education, patented the results, and charged the world for it for the next 2,000 years. Let's calculate the compound interest of credit. When you credit the Greeks with the invention of science, you create a brand value. Western civilization becomes the brand associated with logic, reason, and progress. African civilization becomes the brand associated with raw labor, superstition, and resources. That branding has an economic reality. It determines who gets the loans. It determines who gets the investment. It determines who gets the risk premium. Today, Africa pays a higher interest rate on debt than any other continent. Why? Because the perception of risk is tied to the perception of competence, and the perception of competence was stolen 2,000 years ago. If the world knew that the foundations of banking, geometry, and engineering were African, the risk narrative collapses. The credit rating of the entire continent would flip overnight. The lie is expensive. It costs Africa billions in foreign direct investment every single year. Consider the cost of the Dark Ages. This is the part they don't teach. Why did Europe fall into the Dark Ages after Rome collapsed? Because they were running on a stolen battery. They had the Greek texts, the copies, but they didn't have the deep cultural infrastructure to maintain them. They had cut the cord to the power source, Egypt. When they burned the libraries and severed the connection to the African motherland, the lights went out in Europe for 1,000 years. It wasn't until the Moors, Africans, and Arabs brought the knowledge back into Europe via Spain that the lights turned back on for the Renaissance. The Renaissance was just Europe finding its own stolen notes again. The economic cost of those 1,000 years of darkness, the lost progress, the lost lives, the stagnation, is the price of the theft. And let's look at the museum industry. This is an active crime scene generating active revenue. Walk into the British Museum. Walk into the Louvre. Walk into the Neues Museum in Berlin. What is the main attraction? It's not the local pottery. It's the loot, the Rosetta Stone, the bust of Nefertiti, the Elgin marbles. These institutions generate billions of dollars in tourism revenue annually. That is money generated by African intellectual property, collected by European governments. It is a royalty check that never gets mailed to the creator. They hold the bones of the ancestors and charge admission to see them. They hold the stolen obelisks and sell postcards of them. It is a perpetual motion machine of economic exploitation. They steal the asset, denigrate the creator, and then charge the creator's descendants to see their own heritage. The economic devastation goes deeper than artifacts. It strikes at the psyche of the labor force. When you teach a black child that their ancestors did nothing but pick cotton and carry stones, you are suppressing their economic potential. You are creating a psychological ceiling. But if you teach that child that their ancestors aligned the pyramids to Orion's belt with a precision that laser technology struggles to match, you unlock a different level of ambition. You unlock the owner's mindset. The theft of history is a theft of future GDP. It creates a workforce that believes it is destined to be employees, rather than a workforce that knows it is destined to be architects. The lie isn't just about the past. It's a tax on the future. And it's time to audit the books. We need to tally the lost years, the stolen brand equity, and the tourism revenue, and realize that the West isn't rich because it's smarter. It's rich because it embezzled the inheritance of the South. Wealth doesn't disappear. It transfers. Power doesn't vanish. It moves addresses. We need to track the asset. We need to follow the intellectual capital of Africa as it was laundered through Greece, stored in Rome, hidden during the Dark Ages, and finally deposited in the bank accounts of modern Western supremacy. The transfer is the most important part of the heist because it explains the world you live in right now. Look at the skyline of Washington, D.C. Look at the Washington Monument. It is a Tekken, an Egyptian obelisk. Look at the back of the U.S. dollar bill. It is a pyramid with the eye of Horus. The founding fathers of America knew exactly where the power came from. They didn't copy the Parthenon because they loved Greece. They copied Egypt because they knew Egypt was the source. But they encoded it. They hid the source in plain sight, using the symbols of African power to legitimize a nation built on African slavery. That is the ultimate transfer, using the victim's magic to build the victimizer's house. Let's look at the middlemen. The asset didn't go straight from Egypt to England. It took a detour. When Rome fell, Europe went dark. Why? Because they burned the manual. They lost the connection to the African motherboard. For 700 years, Europe was bathing in mud and superstition. But who kept the light on? The Moors, the Africans and Arabs who conquered Spain. They brought the knowledge back. They didn't just bring swords. They brought libraries. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu was trading books when London was trading wool. The Moors took the Egyptian wisdom, preserved in Arabic translations, and reintroduced it to Europe through Spain. This was the transfer point. The Europeans in the IE North came down to Toledo and Cordoba to translate the books back into Latin. They weren't discovering anything new. They were getting their own stolen property back from the people who kept it safe. Then came the Renaissance. They call it a rebirth. But a rebirth implies the baby died. The baby didn't die. It was living in Africa. The Renaissance was simply Europe finding the receipts again. Men like Leonardo da Vinci and Copernicus didn't just wake up smart. They stood on the shoulders of the Moors, who stood on the shoulders of the Egyptians. But here is the mechanism of the transfer, the credit swap. As soon as Europe got the knowledge back, they bleached the lineage. They acknowledged the Greek translation, but ignored the Moorish courier and the Egyptian author. They cut out the middleman and the originator. By the time the Enlightenment arrived, the African origin had been completely scrubbed from the record. The asset was now fully in European hands, with a new title, deed forged in the university system. The transfer wasn't just intellectual, it was psychological. This is the part that hurts. When you transfer the credit for civilization from south to north, you also transfer the confidence. The West walks with a swagger today. They walk with the unshakable belief that they are the architects of the world, the solvers of problems, the masters of reason. That confidence is a stolen asset. It belongs to you. Conversely, the transfer moved shame to the south. By erasing the history of Kemet, they taught the African child that their history is a void. They transferred the imposter syndrome to the creator. You have a continent of people apologizing for their condition, unaware that the algorithms governing the modern world were written by their ancestors. The transfer stole the owner's mindset and replaced it with the employee's mindset. But the elite know. This is the secret societies, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians. They know the truth. Why do you think their rituals are dressed in Egyptian drag? Why do they call their leaders Grand Master? Why do they use the square and the compass? Because they know that the master builder was Hiram Abiff, a metaphor for the Egyptian architect. They hoard the truth in their lodges while feeding the lie to the public schools. The transfer created a two-tier reality, the truth for the rulers, that Egypt is the mother, and the lie for the masses, that Greece is the father. They are gatekeeping the origin story of humanity because they know that if the transfer is ever reversed, the hierarchy of the world flips. They are holding a stolen check that they can never cash publicly without admitting the crime. The statute of limitations on truth never expires. You can bury a lie under 1,000 years of sand, under a mountain of books, under a billion-dollar movie industry, but eventually, the wind changes. Eventually, the rain comes. And right now, we are living in the storm. The awakening is not a future event. It is happening in real time. The internet broke the monopoly. For centuries, they controlled the printing press, the university, and the library. They could burn the books they didn't like, but they cannot burn the cloud. The receipts are digital now. The walls of the temple are being read again, not by colonial gatekeepers, but by the descendants of the builders. The code has been cracked. The Greek miracle is being exposed for what it is, a colonial fairy tale. Look at the technology. DNA evidence is proving the African origins of the populations they tried to whiten. Ground-penetrating radar is finding civilizations in the Sahara and the Amazon that defy the primitive narrative. The lie is under siege by data. Every time a young person opens their phone and sees the side-by-side comparison of an Egyptian statue and a Greek copy, a synapse fires. A shackle breaks. The awakening is the reversal of the erasure. It is the moment you realize that the mystery of how the pyramids were built is only a mystery if you refuse to respect the intelligence of the people who built them. Once you accept that Africans were master mathematicians and engineers, the mystery vanishes, and respect takes its place. This is a call to action. It is not enough to just know this history. You have to own it. You are not a spectator in this story. You are the protagonist. The blood that flows in your veins is the same blood that mapped the zodiac at Dendera. The mind you use to navigate the world is the same operating system that designed the hypostyle hall. You are not a descendant of slaves. You are a descendant of the people who were enslaved because they were too dangerous to be left free. They stole your history to break your spirit. Reclaiming it is an act of war against the narrative of inferiority. It is the ultimate rebellion. When you walk into a math class, you are walking into your grandfather's house. When you study medicine, you're practicing your grandmother's craft. Stop asking for permission to be great. You invented greatness. The awakening means building again. We cannot just look back at the pyramids and weep. We have to look forward. We have to use the stolen blueprint to build new systems. We need African-centered education that doesn't start with Greece. We need economic systems that circulate wealth like they did in Greenwood and Timbuktu. We need to take the transfer and reverse the flow. The intellectual capital must return to the source. The confidence must return to the South. The shame must be returned to the thief. This is the end of the long sleep. The alarm clock has been ringing for 400 years, and we are finally hitting the snooze button no more. So, here is the charge. Don't just watch this video and scroll. Take the receipt. Share the evidence. Challenge the teacher. Rewrite the textbook. The lie only works if we agree to it. The moment we stop nodding along to the Greek miracle, the mirage evaporates. The Sphinx is still there, waiting. It has seen the Greeks come and go. It has seen the Romans come and go. It has seen the British come and go. It is still standing, looking east, waiting for you to remember who you are. The nose is broken, but the eyes are open. The silence is over. The stone is speaking. Are you listening?